What makes a perfect poem perfect? Well, I've been on a 30-year odyssey, a journey really, and that's been one of the questions that has been at the core of my insight, not only for myself, but for many, many others over the years. And I'm wonderfully grateful to have been on this journey. But that's exactly what we want to focus on today on Poetry, Passion, and Pleasure podcast. I'm your host, Dale Byron, and we're going to dig right into it. So here's the thing. Have you ever felt like, sometimes you just say, to heck with it, to hell with it. I just want to have a moment for myself. I want to have a moment to come back to myself, to recenter, to re-engage with the world in a more skillful way. And often I've found that a poem can be, if it's the right poem, can be an incredibly important tool to help us do that. So what I want to explore today is I've chosen a particular poem which I hope you'll find to be a great poem, what I'm calling a perfect poem, in the sense that I'm going to describe kind of 5 areas after we hear the poem that I think this poem rises to, and it will help us begin to have more of a sense of how we can choose more of these poems for ourselves. So the poem I've chosen today is a poem by the wonderful, amazing poet Mary Oliver, who we just lost to this plane anyway. I think it's been about 4 or 5 years now. An amazing poet, an amazingly popular poet, and I want to bring one of her most famous poems, and then we're going to talk about why I think it's perfect. Okay, it's called The Journey, again, by Mary Oliver. Goes like this. One day, you finally knew what you had to do and began. One day, you finally knew what you had to do and began, though the voices around you kept shouting their bad advice, though the whole house began to tremble, and you felt the old tug at your ankles. Mend my life, mend my life, each voice cried. Are you starting to get the scene? Are you starting to get that one day you finally knew what you had to do and began? Somebody said you can walk 1,000 miles in those first 2 lines of that poem. One day you finally knew what you had to do and began, though the voices around you kept shouting their bad advice, though the whole house began to tremble, and you felt the old tug at your ankles. Mend my life, each voice cried. But you didn't stop. You didn't stop. You knew what you had to do, though the wind pried with its stiff fingers at the very foundation, though their melancholy was terrible. It was already late enough, and a wild night, and the road full of fallen branches and stones. But little by little, as you left their voices behind, the stars began to burn through the sheets of clouds, and there was a new voice, that you slowly recognized as your own, that kept you company as you strode deeper and deeper into the world, determined to do the only thing you could do, determined to save the only life you could save. And there was a new voice, which you slowly recognized as your own, that kept you company as you strode deeper and deeper into the world, determined to do the only thing you could do, determined to save the only life you could save. the only life you could save, your life. Perfect poem, in my estimation, in my humble estimation, by Mary Oliver. Now, why is that? Why is that? Well, I think there are 5 reasons that we can zero in on. And again, I'm saying this because this poem, this one poem, I don't know how many times, thousands of times I've read this poem, and countless times I have spoken it, performed it in front of other people at meetings, in speeches, and one-on-one workshops, one-on-one coaching sessions, I should say. And I can't tell you how many times I can remember one young woman executive, brilliant executive, who I was coaching, and this poem was so powerful that I can always tell when somebody says, I need a copy of that, or I want a copy of that, or they would buy the Mary Oliver volume of poems, so they would have this poem handy. For this particular woman that I'm talking about, this young executive who was brilliant, she had this tendency to get caught up in the voices of others, the request of others, at her own peril, really. And so that one day you finally knew what you had to do and began, though the voices around you kept shouting their bad advice. That spoke to her. That spoke to her. Or I could think about another, an entrepreneur who had started a fairly large family business, and this poem just struck right to the heart. And he was not someone who was normally given to reading poetry, but this poem, The Journey, spoke to him because it talked to him about the passion and the fire that was, as they say, in his belly for starting his business. And there were many people there were many voices around him that were saying it wasn't a good idea, was not a good idea. So why do I think, again, so many people have given me feedback over the years that this is a poem that has been incredibly skillful, incredibly helpful for them. So one thing that I would think about in my 5 things is that the poem has to be relatable. It has to meet people where they are. Everybody is not a person who is in love with poetry. The way that most of us engage with poetry are on certain occasions, and those occasions are usually occasions of celebration, or the other end of the spectrum, occasions of loss and grief. But when I say that a perfect poem must relate to people and meet them where they are, I mean that it has to have just a very gettable kind of quality, a quality that we just sort of get it and grok it, and it just strikes us as something which is not aloof and rarefied, but very down to earth and gettable. So a poem has to be relatable, has to meet people where they are, either whether it's joyfulness and happiness or grief and loss, and anywhere in between. Also, number 2, the poem can't be insultingly clear. Can't be insultingly clear. And I think this Mary Oliver poem just weaves right through that. It's accessible and we get it, and yet it's not insultingly clear. When you think about insultingly clear, think about the lines that are in greeting cards where we're beat over the head with the message, you will feel sad or you will feel happy, and we're beat over the head with the message, and it makes for doggerel. It makes for, quite honestly, quite bad poetry. That's okay. I mean, greeting cards are fine in their own context, but it's most often you will not find a perfect or a great poem in a greeting card. So it can't be insultingly clear. Number 3, it tells a story with words, with images, with metaphors. I mean, you think about, the metaphor, you knew what you had to do, the wind pried with its stiff fingers at the very foundation. That just gives us a feeling, a felt sense of it. And these images, it was already late enough and a wild night and the road full of fallen branches and stones. We immediately get that scene. You look out at a road, wind blown, it's dark and the rain is pelting and the road, as the poem says, is full of fallen branches and stones. We just get the difficulty of that scene. We feel it, not just hear it, not just the language, not just abstractions, but we feel it. And when you talk about that the stars began to burn through the sheets of clouds, and there was a new voice that you slowly recognized as your own. So there's a way that we're telling a story, but we're also using images. We're not just using language in its linear, logical format. And so I say this number 3, it tells a story with words, images, metaphors, mysteriously transcending the limits of linear language. And it does that with this combination of all those things. Number 4 out of 5 for my sort of what makes a perfect poem perfect. Number 4 is it helps because it's not trying to be helpful. Paradoxical, I know, but I really believe this. This is what I've observed over all these years and working with many, many poems, is that the poem definitely has a message. It tells a story. It has its images. It has its metaphors. It's definitely has a point of view, but it is not, at least in a traditional classic way, it is not propaganda. It is not trying to beat us over the head. And it's not trying to fix us or to be helpful in that kind of fix-it way. It just isn't doing that. A good poem is like a systems consciousness. It is working with second and third order consequences, not just first order. That's why we step away from a poem and sometimes we go, I don't even know, nothing's changed, but somehow I feel a little bit better. And number 5 on my list of what makes a great poem great or a perfect poem perfect is how we're saying it. It helps us, it helps you remember yourself in a different way. I often speak of this word. As a poet and a poetry lover, I'm also a word nerd in the sense that I love language. Don't trust it always. And I'll do another podcast on that later. But I love language. I love language. It can help us, if you think about that word, remember. Think about what that means, to remember ourselves in a different way, to put ourselves back together in a different, more skillful way, more healed, more engaged, more mindful. And speaking of that, I said, it's helpful. It helps you. It helps us remember ourselves. It helps you remember yourself in the way that you want to remember yourself. Something critical. Remembering something critical to your life. Something deepening. Something when you're triggered. You know how when each of us is triggered, and it happens to each of us in different ways, but we are off to the races. We are believing that the story in our mind is who we are. We're believing that the story in our mind is the truth and not a story, not an interpretation. We believe that our beliefs are actually isness when we are triggered, and we are totally identified with whatever it is we're thinking. And that was my last point, is that something mindfully larger than our ego entangled self, so that we gain the observer again. And even more, so we can step into this mindful world of just now, just consciousness. Poem can help us do all those things, all those things. One day you finally knew what you had to do, said Mary Oliver, and began, though the voices around you kept shouting their bad advice, though the whole house began to tremble, and you felt the old tug at your ankles. Mend my life, each voice cried. Now, I just want to stop as I read the poem one more time to say, sometimes I've made this point so many times for myself mostly and for others, is that sometimes those voices we hear, the ones that keep shouting their bad advice, they're not external at all. Those are sometimes not the toughest voices. The toughest voices are the ones inside us, our own voices that are giving us bad advice. And that's that back to that point about being attached to something. So our identity is attached to a set of ideas or a story. This poem says, how can we step back from that? So their bad advice, though the whole house began to tremble, and you felt the old tug at your ankles. Mend my life, each voice cried. We can't. Have you noticed? We cannot fix anyone. And they say, mend my life, mend my life. And, we just know what a trap that is. What a trap that is. But you didn't stop. The poem goes on, but you didn't stop. You did not stop. You knew what you had to do, though the wind pried with its stiff fingers at the very foundation, though their melancholy was terrible. Those are those amazing images again. It was already late enough and a wild night, and the road full of fallen branches and stones, but little by little, as you left their voices behind, the stars began to burn through the sheets of clouds. And there was a new voice, and there was a new voice which you slowly recognized as your own, that kept you company as you strode deeper and deeper into the world, determined to do the only thing you could do, determined to save the only life you could save. This would be a great poem to memorize, which I have, and I have a copy here in front of me, so as to not stumble. But this is a great poem to memorize, or memorize pieces of it. Because if you think about it, another metaphor that I think about with this poem is it's a way of, when you think about the metaphor of a signal to noise ratio, and we're looking for the signal. We're looking for our signal. And there's noise that we're going to have to contend with. Some of the noise coming from inside us, some noise coming from outside of us. People saying, mend my life, mend my life. So noise comes from different places. But how do we find our signal again? How do we find our center again? How do we come back to ourselves? Well, a perfect poem can help. And I've tried to give a few of the ideas from my perspective, from my work with poetry over these last 30 years or so. What makes a perfect poem? What makes a poem that you're going to want to kind of keep handy and maybe have for yourself at different times? In final, as we kind of close this edition of the podcast, I said, no one has a pipeline to poetic truth. And I'd be the first to say that. So you have to decide you have to decide what is the perfect poem. I just wanted to serve up some ideas from my work. No one has a pipeline to the poetic truth. However, I would say, again, after 30 years of reading, writing, teaching, talking, thinking about, and savoring poems, these 5 criteria that we've worked with is it's relatable, it's not insultingly clear, or it is relatable and meets us where we are in our lives. It's not insultingly clear. It tells a story with words and images and metaphors, and actually can transcend a great poem, a good poem, a perfect poem, transcends the limitations of linear language. And that's mysterious. How does that work? I don't know. It works though. And number four, it helps because it's not trying to be helpful. It's not propaganda. And finally, it helps us remember ourselves, remember something very, very important, and step into a more mindful space. Okay. I hope you enjoyed this edition of the podcast. I hope you enjoyed that poem, and that maybe if you didn't know about it, now you do. Now you do. Okay, so that is a wrap. Thank you very much. As I always say, thank you very, very much for your listening ear. Let others know about this podcast. I'm trying to get the word out. And yeah, make a comment. Do, whatever strikes you as something you'd like to do would be great. And as I say, pass it along to someone you think might be interested in this, might find value in it. And as I always like to say, until next time and next poems, take good care of yourself, and also take good care of someone else too.